Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors and other inspiring guests, doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. This week on the show, I'm speaking to activist and all-round incredible human being, Payzee Mahmod. I learned of the amazing work Payzee is doing and her story after learning about the devastating brutal killing of Payzee's older sister, Banaz Mahmod, in a so-called honour killing in 2006. Banaz was a young woman with a huge appetite for life, laughter, and kindness, and her death has had far-reaching and long-lasting impacts for all those who knew and loved her, and also for the world at large. Payzee Mahmod is a survivor and activist tackling gender-based violence. As a British Kurd with lived experience, she is a passionate advocate and campaigner, raising awareness about harmful practices including child marriage, female genital mutilation, virginity testing, and hymenoplasty. After being forced into a child marriage aged 16, Payzee led the 3-year-long campaign to change the legal age of marriage from 16 to 18 in England and Wales. Payzee now uses her platform to spread awareness on honour-based abuse, child marriage, and promoting the importance of gender inclusion and raising money for good causes. Just a little trigger warning. In this episode, we talk about some difficult topics including loss of a sibling, abusive relationships, child marriage, and FGM. So if you need to return to this episode at a later date or skip it altogether, please do. Hi Payzee, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Hi, Samia. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing really well. So looking forward to speaking with you.
I have been really actually just in awe of seeing the work that you're doing in the UK and around the world to advocate for the rights of girls and women, and also just learning about your own personal story, which has been full of grief, pain, hardship, but also now hope and rebuilding and love. And you're doing so much for yourself, but also for the world around us. And so I'm so grateful that you've made the time to speak to me today. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you about who you are and everything that's been going on. And I just think that our listeners will benefit so much from hearing from you today.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the platform to speak to your listeners, and hopefully people can take something away and feel either inspired or made aware of issues they maybe haven't heard of before or don't know much about.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, such an honor for me. So I want to start a little bit on in your life. So you moved to the UK from Iran. I believe you were like maybe 10 or 11 years old.
Yes, exactly. I was 11.
Yeah, what was that like? Because I imagine that your life in Iran was a certain way or was very different in some ways to what life in the UK can be like. But what was that like for you? Because also I feel 11 is that really annoying age where you're like, you're not a teenager, but like you're, in terms of like your body, you are like pubescent and you're like going through puberty and you're changing, but still very young. And then you're on the cusp of like secondary school and like life changing. And it's very not an easy age for a young person. But what was it like for you having so much change and all of that was happening to you at that time?
Gosh, so I have to say, I think at the time, neither me or my four sisters really understood, first of all, why we were moving here. We didn't know anything about the UK prior to coming here. We obviously had some very, I would say, extravagant maybe thoughts about what London would be like living in Iran. Obviously, we had a TV, but electricity was very much non-existent. So when we could watch TV, and sometimes we saw shows that had like voiceover in Farsi, in Persian, you would just, anything that you saw that wasn't in Iran, in our heads was, oh, this is what London will look like. And so we had this image of this very high tech country. And I think we didn't really think about the kinds of people that we'd find here. Just naturally, I always thought, and my sisters too, would just be alongside other Kurdish people. And I think coming here, it was almost like our minds were blown. There were so many different types of people. You had never crossed paths with anyone that wasn't Kurdish or Iranian in the previous 11 years of living in Iran. And then all of a sudden, I'm in London, and you can only imagine London, you'll know, in the 90s was a very buzzing, vibrant, full of energy, this awesome city with so many people and different music and like pop stars and all these cultural kind of elements that were just mind blowing to us. So it was quite a culture shock, I will say that. I'd never seen girls in miniskirts. I'd never seen boys and girls playing together. That was quite different for me. So even at school, it was really difficult to integrate. So I came straight into primary school, didn't speak a word of English, none of me and my sisters. So immediately we were targets for bullying. There was that kind of homophobic, racist targeting that we found ourselves experiencing almost straight away. I remember my first school that I was in, we were placed in a hotel in Edgware Road, and there was this boy, and it was crazy because he was actually Middle Eastern. He was Iranian himself. And this boy was the only boy that could speak my language because I spoke Farsi as well at the time. But he used to just bully me, like he would kick me and he would literally draw blood from my legs, like he was
Oh
kicking
my
me under
God.
the table. Yeah, he was so horrible to me. And I just remember my parents just saying to me, just ignore him. And I just had to go to school every day and experience this boy bullying me in the playground, pushing me. But it was really difficult as children migrate into this very different world, having no one really walk us through all these different things, the language barrier, the cultural barrier. It was very lonely. And even though all me and my sisters were going through the same thing, we didn't really speak about it. I think we were all just, we just have to push through. It's not something we spoke about openly. We were quite mesmerized by things like the Spice Girls and girl bands, and would find ourselves watching like Top of the Pops and Pepsi Max on the weekends, printing out lyrics. But it was really difficult, especially because my parents really didn't want us to integrate. So obviously, as you mentioned, I'm 11 and this world is very intriguing to me and I want to get involved. I want to mix with friends. But my parents were very tight on the fact that they didn't want us mixing, to the point where even though we were trying to learn English quite quickly, they didn't even want us speaking English at home. My parents would get quite annoyed. It's a lesson I'm quite grateful now for because I speak my mother tongue fluently. But at the time, it was really hard because we were torn essentially between two worlds. And I think that experience of a migrant child is really something that we should be speaking more about, because you're just expected to come into this country and fit in with everyone else, make friends, and just mold yourself into this society. But it's extremely hard. And I don't think there's enough support for children like us to
Yeah.
get into this society and live a happy life.
Mm. Yeah. I'm a daughter of immigrants.
Mhm.
And I remember growing up, it felt challenging because my parents didn't understand the system. My
Mm.
parents had like fairly decent English because by the time I was born, they'd been here for a good few years, but not amazing. And so
Right.
I spent a lot of my childhood translating things, writing letters to school, writing letters to the doctor, all of those kind of things that I still sometimes do today. But
Yeah.
and I think that's a very unique experience. But it's so different to yours because as a child that was born and brought up here, I grew up fluent in English. I
Mm.
grew up understanding the systems, and I also had the support of teachers and friends and peers who I could communicate with. And so, although it felt challenging in lots of ways because my parents didn't understand it, I think there was still so much support for me. And I was able to navigate through the system and I was
Mm.
fine. But I can only imagine how difficult it is when you are a child and also your parents don't understand the system and don't speak the language and don't have the right kind of support and understanding. That sounds incredibly lonely. And you're right, like we don't talk nearly enough about how difficult it is for children who are immigrants trying to fit in, especially when they don't have that sort of support or that
Mhm.
um, like the guidance from your parents in the same way, because it's just like it's generation after two generations then at the same time that are trying to
Yeah.
figure it out. Whereas at least I'm the generation that was all right, because my parents had to try and figure it out. So yeah, that's super interesting. And yeah, and I think you're right. Like I do think we need to talk more about it. And so when it came to your life, you I mean, I don't know what the right word is. I don't know if it is if it's tragically or actually just really shockingly married at the age of 16, which we know up until fairly recently, which is also thanks to your work, was the legal age of marriage in the UK, which when I think about it now completely blows my mind, because what is the 16-year-old? Like, how could a 16-year-old make that level of decision?
Yeah.
So I guess the issue was that it was the legal age in the UK. But you did get married to somebody who was considerably older than you. What sort of led up to that, and what was that marriage like?
So I think maybe to give you some context and also to your listeners, maybe these are some themes that people might relate to, this idea of your family status in the community, reputation.
Mm.
And essentially, I know this is, I don't want to say it's only in ethnic communities because it's absolutely not true. You find this, it's a global problem. Actually, on the same topic, I was recently watching Crazy Rich Asians,
Oh yeah.
and I'm sure you've seen the film. And it really, for me, I felt like, wow, I really relate to some of these themes, because this is where we're talking about the family's reputation and not wanting your sons to marry certain girls or into certain families. And it really is a global thing that we don't talk much about. So in my family, when we came to the UK, we had some of our other family members in the UK already, so some uncles and aunts and grandparents. And what happened was, one of my sisters, so she's my second eldest, she had been really, really submersed into this new world that she found herself in, and really wanted to experiment with things like makeup and, I guess, talking to boys and the regular things that all teenagers find themselves wanting to explore. And that was obviously quite a problem for my parents, particularly for my dad, because they worried so much about what other people would think of them and the shame that things like that would bring onto their family name. And what happened, we were only in the UK for a few years, but that sister of mine basically ended up clashing with my dad quite a lot. And she then would tell professionals, so her teachers, who then escalated this to social services. She mentioned that she was experiencing verbal abuse and honor-based abuse and a lot of control. And
Mm.
essentially, they removed her from the house. So social services removed my sister. And when that got out into the community, that was a big kind of, I guess, shameful event. And people would start casting my family out and essentially would say that they didn't want to associate with my family, that they couldn't control their own daughters, and they didn't want their children to be influenced by this. And that kind of I would say, kick-started a chain of events. So because my parents felt like their honor was disgraced, their family name, they were being shamed. They thought if we were to do something to reverse that, maybe the community would see us differently. And so this is how my dad, within a space of 6 months, he married off both me and my sister Banaz to complete strangers. So that's what led essentially to our marriages. As you said, I was 16 at the time. I had just finished school. I was really excited about going off to college and, I guess, starting a new life and being more independent. The silly things like not wearing uniform and just being excited about making new friends and having a very different lifestyle, a bit more freedom. But it came to a halt very quickly when I found out that same year when I started college that my dad wanted me to marry this man. And I knew that it was something that I couldn't really say no to. I just, through your relationship with your parents, the boundaries you can and you can't test. And obviously, growing up in quite a restricted environment, my parents being very clear on things like talking to boys and dating and bringing shame onto them. I absolutely knew from the conversation that I had with my mum about getting married, it wasn't a choice. This was me being coerced. So I'm a child and I'm being essentially told this is the best thing for you. And obviously, don't have any control, I don't have any power. And I certainly didn't understand the concept, or didn't know at least, that there was support and I could go and speak to somebody. And obviously, being that young, I didn't have it in me to say, okay, I'm going to speak to my teachers. I'm going to tell someone
Mhm.
about this. I just felt very invisible. And watching my sister Banaz also being put through the same thing, she was 17. She'd only got married about a few months before me. So this all happened in a very, very short space of time. And it almost just felt like this ball that was in motion, and it was just like rolling and rolling. Before I knew it, after the conversation with my mum, the next thing I knew, there was the engagement party, the nikah. Then
Mm.
we were going out shopping for dresses, and everything was just being organized in front of me. And I was living in this multi-dimensional world where I'm just a child, and I'm excited about starting college and making friends, but then I'm buying wedding dresses and buying jewelry, and getting dragged around from shops to shops, and this random person is going to be my husband. It was such a strange thing to experience, but I think this is where this kind of two identities, two worlds for me really started developing. I have to be what my parents want me to be, but I'm still going to try and chase this side of me that I'm really wanting, and fighting for my own identity.
It's so interesting because when we think about this idea of coercion and forced marriage, so many of the ideas we have are around like a physical restraint or like a emotional blackmail or a financial control, some form of active
Hmm.
coercion. But the reality is when it comes to a child, you don't even need to do those things because a
No.
child is not empowered enough or often mature enough to make that decision. And I think very rightly so to believe that the age of 16 falls under that
Yeah.
umbrella local town for a lot of local city or whatever it is, like no idea of the world, confusion about who they can trust and what they can do. Also uncertainty in a body. You're still at 16 as especially as a woman, as a girl going through so many changes and so many things. Like there's so many layers of it, but this real understanding that to force a child does not mean you have to physically force their hand, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes it's the absence of choice, it's that
Hmm.
unreal choice. So to simply, I mean, I don't, you haven't said, but I don't imagine that your parents actually asked you. But even if they did, as you said, like even if they had said the words, Payzee, will you marry this man?
Yeah.
You were not in a position at that time to say, no, I don't want to marry this man. Like, who's this man? You know, you wouldn't have been able to do that. You were not empowered. And
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
they have to voice to somebody, whether they're a 16-year-old or they're a 36-year-old, right? Whether there have to be so many things in place to allow that choice to really come about. And when it comes to somebody as young as 16, that just isn't there. And then combine that with the different expectations and pressures that come with various cultures and also within any patriarchal society. I think this is
Hmm.
the case. It's very complicated and like
Yeah.
really, really difficult.
Yeah, but you actually, the way you said it was just so perfect, because it took me years to actually understand that I was a victim of child marriage, which is a form of forced marriage, because I didn't have the capacity to consent. But I imagine the same thing, that actually my parents were never physical to me, they never threatened me. But in the way that they brought the conversation to me, as you said, it wasn't a question. They said
Mm.
to me, we would really, if you did this, we think it would be good for you. And obviously, my entire trust as a 16-year-old is in my parents. I love them, I adore them. I just want to make them happy. And this is where that power imbalance plays in. And I think it's so good that you talked about that. Force and coercion, it isn't always physical, and it exists in so many other nuanced ways. So that was really good that you brought that up. And I hope it gets people thinking when they think someone was forced, actually think about what that force looked like, not necessarily them being physically beaten, but what else did they experience mentally and emotionally to be forced into that position.
This is a completely different example, but I know of a lot of people who are, like a little bit older now, but will say that when I was at school, my parents put loads of pressure on me to study certain subjects and to go down a career path, like to become a doctor, for example. So much pressure, blah blah, and I didn't actually want to do it. I wanted to be an artist, right? And it's funny because I don't know if it's funny is the right word, but when you speak to that family or you speak to that parent or parents, they will say, no, we never forced you, we never said to you this is what you have to do, we never made you sign that form or take that subject. And it's just this idea of, if that some people have, that if you are not physically making somebody to do something, you are not forcing them. But it's not fair. If you're not giving an open and free choice and you're not empowering them to make that decision, then I'm sure that it does definitely come under coercion. But I've heard that a lot, and to some degree I felt it myself as well growing up. And if I ever say it to my mum, she will say, no, I never forced you.
Do you know, for me, the real test is, if you were to say no, to reject whatever it was, whether your parents said, study this, go down this career path, marry this person, the real test is, if the person said no or refused and said, that's not for me, what would that reaction be? And that reveals the truth. For example, I have a lot of discussions around arranged marriage, and I do believe arranged marriages can happen in the sense that if two people organically meet through other people and there is free will and free choice, and they both want to get married to consenting adults, I think it can be great for both parties if they're happy. But I think if two people are introduced to each other quite tactically, and then if one person feels even a small bit of pressure where they think, if I say no, I'm going to get some kind of reaction, that to me immediately falls under the lighter end of force. So there's a grey area, but it's ultimately, what would the reaction be if you said no?
Yeah, exactly. And when you are 16, there's so much fear about what would happen if I say no, and very, very rightly so. But then we move forward, maybe just a couple of years in your life after you got married, and I know that your marriage was very toxic and harmful and abusive in lots of ways. And then we move forward 2 years, and in one of the most horrific things I have ever read and seen about, your sister Banaz was murdered, but also forever changed your life in so many ways, because not only did you very tragically lose your sister, but it impacted the relationship that you have with your family. And I can't even imagine in how many other ways your life and you as a person have changed because of what happened to Banaz.
So just to say that I guess I think the tragedies in both me, Banaz's, my entire family really started when these marriages were, I guess, forced on us. Banaz was unhappy in her marriage. It was abusive, and she was very vocal about that. But unfortunately, she never received any support, not from our family, not from the police. And all her cries for help were completely ignored from both of the different groups of people that she went to. And as you mentioned, she was subsequently murdered because she left that marriage, because she bravely walked out, which in our communities, for women to actually stand up and say, I'm leaving, to make that stand, it's extremely brave and it's so dangerous for them. But Banaz did that regardless. She wanted a better life for herself, which something, when I think of her, I really admire her bravery and the fact that she said no to the abuse. She stood up and left. And when she was murdered, I think my perspective, it took me a little while, because like at first I was just in a state of shock. I could not understand for months. I could not process this was a real thing. I'd never lost anybody before my sister was murdered. I had never thought about death. I was only 17 years old, so not really a concept I ever had to think about. But when she was murdered, I just knew there is absolutely no way I can stay in this marriage. I already wanted to leave. And to be honest, I went to my parents countless times and I said to them, I was a 17-year-old, 16-year-old, and I was saying to my parents, I don't want to be with this man. Just please let me divorce him. And they would always say, absolutely not. And I ended up falling pregnant at 16. This was I knew I was very strong-minded in that I did not want to spend my life with this man. And actually, I knew at that age, at 16, I decided by myself, without any support, with everybody criticizing me, judging me, blackmailing me, saying all sorts of things to me, but I knew I couldn't continue that pregnancy. And it was a choice I had to make for my future self. And I'm really glad that I made that choice not to keep the baby. But fast forward a year and a half after Banaz losing her life, I just decided I was going to do everything in my power to get out. And this was when I really put the brakes on. And I told my parents, I ended up back at their house and I said, I am not going back to this man. Because actually, after my sister had died, he became extremely abusive, even more than before. And he became very threatening. And he would use my sister's death as a way of threatening me and telling me that this could happen to me. So it became very real for me. And I was in a state of fight or flight. I knew I had to leave this man, whatever it took. The police were a bit more responsive, I think, given my sister's failure. So they did support me with things like safety alarms and checking in with me all the time. But I remember the day my sister's funeral was literally a few days away, and I got my divorce in May of 2006. And it was honestly one of the most difficult times in my life, but also a fresh start. It was that multi-dimensional thing again, where I was grieving for my sister. It was so fresh, losing her. At the same time, I was so glad that I could leave this man and potentially go to university, because he didn't want me to go to university. And that was one of my biggest dreams. I was the first to go to university in my entire family, having only studied a few years in the UK to then go on to university. I fought to get my driver's license, all of these things whilst my divorce was happening, because I was so determined to get a life of my own, an identity of my own, and leave all that behind me. And it's all in some really twisted, sad way. It's all because of my sister's death that this fire within me ignited, and I had to fight, because I just knew it was either give in and God knows what could have happened to me, or fight for myself, for my future self, and do better and chase my dreams. And I can say I had no support. Literally, nobody was in my corner. I was working part-time, trying to get my driver's lessons, and my family would say to me, "You don't need a driver's lessons. You're only 18. You're not going to drive. You don't need a driver. You don't need to drive. One day when you get married again, you'll have a driver. Someone will drive you." And all these crazy things. But all I could think about was the fact that my sister was so brave, and she took that decision to chase a better life. And I have to do this too. I literally, when I think about it, I was fighting the world. I was so alone, and nobody would even listen to me. So yeah, it's all thanks to my sister. It's all thanks to her bravery, which also has the flip side to that is the fact that even though she really bravely walked out, she didn't get to experience all these things. Sorry.
No, do apologize.
Yeah, that makes me really sad, because I think she deserved a second chance at life. I think she deserved to be happy, to chase her dreams, to have children, to have the love of her life, to work. These are all things she wanted to do. And she started that journey, but unfortunately, she couldn't finish it. That's why I say it's a really sad, tragic way to actually get inspired, but it made me so much stronger. At the same time, I was crumbling inside and grieving for her, but it put me in a state where I just looked forward and I couldn't look back.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking about that, and for sharing that, because I can't imagine like how painful it must have been, the loss of your sister alone, let alone everything else that was going on, and also to be so alone and isolated yourself. Banaz's death, like, while it has been and continues to be incredibly painful, in a bittersweet way, helped you in lots of ways, but I think also has helped so many other people, because the more people find out about what happened to her, the more awareness it is raising about this issue in the UK. Because I think there is also this idea that some of these issues relating to forced marriage, child marriage, FGM, that they don't really happen here in the UK, but this is happening on a level that I don't think we even fully know about.
Yeah.
But also, as you alluded to, the police really failed your sister. Like, she repeatedly, I think it was like 5 times or something, that she made formal reports being very specific about things that had happened to her and the real threat to her life. And they failed to act. And even once she had died, it took them a good few days to figure out what had actually happened to
Yeah.
her as well, which I can only imagine was just completely, so full of anguish for all of you. And I think one of the things I think about a lot is that, Banaz's story, in terms of how she was ultimately killed, is really, really horrific. And sometimes I fear that is what trumps everything, that this really awful thing happened to her. But I wondered if you would like to take this opportunity actually to tell us more about who she was and all the great things about her, because in some ways we don't get enough of that when it comes to her story, because unfortunately this awful thing that happened overshadows who she was. But I know just from seeing what you write and hearing you talk that she was amazing.
Thank you so much for asking this question, Samia. It means so much because every time people ask me about her, it's, as you say, the one thing which I think is very important to obviously acknowledge what happened and to talk about that so that there's learnings from that. But we don't near enough talk about people who have died in such tragic circumstances. We don't talk about their dreams and who they were, their personalities, what they liked, and just really who they were, because a picture is a picture. And sometimes I do share pictures, and I think it's really important. I try and do it as much as I can without giving too much away, because I want to hold her close to me. But I want the world to know the sweet person that Banaz was. And I know we hear this all the time about people who we've lost, but I genuinely mean every time that I say Banaz was such a sweetheart. She really was the kind of person that you meet and you just remember her, because she was just very caring, very sweet, very nurturing. She loved children and the elderly. Like, one of her dreams was actually to work with the elderly. I remember during her college years, she had a work placement, and we went around. We went on a bus. We took the wrong bus because, as you mentioned, we'd never been out of the area. We took the wrong bus the wrong way and ended up having to take the other bus and walk for ages. And it was so cold this one winter. And we ended up going to an elderly care home where she wanted to do her work experience. And we had her little CV and it was freezing. I remember us walking up the hill, and we didn't have our phones at the time. We didn't have phones. We just had a Google Maps to print out and A to Z. And we were walking up and down this hill trying to find this home. And she was the kind of person that, even if you're having a really tough time, she just always remained so positive. And I kept saying to her, "Oh, can we just forget about this? It's getting dark now." It was like 6 p.m. and I was like really scared. I just wanted to get home. We'd never been out alone in the dark. And she was just so optimistic, saying, "Come on, let's just keep looking. We're going to find it. Maybe it's on the next road." We ended up finding it. She got her work placement there for her college. That's the kind of person she was. She just loved spending time with the elderly, nurturing children. Whilst she was still alive, we had one of my nephews, the only grandchild in our family. He was about 6 months when she passed away. And my God, she adored this child. He's about 18 now, going on 19, but I just remember she would play with him the whole time he was here. She would do anything and everything for him. Even I remember I would get bored and move on and let him go back to his mom, and she would say, "No, I can bathe him, I can make him sleep, let's take him for a walk." She just was so caring, and she dreamed of having her own family. She was very family orientated, actually. She loved when the family got together. And even when we were married, we lived together at some point. So we lived together for about 10 months. And
Nice.
whenever we had people over, she would be in the kitchen and chopping up the onions and starting to cook and handling everything. Whereas I would be like, oh, I don't want to touch the meat. And oh my gosh, this is so horrible. And I honestly was such a brat. And she was the mature one that would keep both of us in check and make sure the house was tidy. Looking back, I wish I helped more because I was such a brat and I would complain and constantly go on about, oh, why do we have to have visitors? That typical, obviously, I was so like young because I was a child. And I would say to her, oh, why do we have to do this? And why does this person have to come over? And she'd say, come on, help me do this. And can you tidy this after me? Can you check on the stew? She was just such a caring, she loved entertaining, she loved hosting. I remember one year, the year before she passed away, it was my parents' birthday. They're born in the same month, different years. And she'd gone to Croydon and she'd ordered this huge birthday cake. And to be honest, growing up, we didn't really celebrate birthdays traditionally. It was just something that my parents did for my little sister because she was quite young. And I got thrown in there because we were born the same month. But Banaz had gone and she'd got on this massive cake and written happy birthday, mum and dad on it. And she'd invited my uncle. She made such a big deal of it. And it was so sweet. And I remember everyone being like, oh, Banaz, come on. There was no need for all that. But she really went all out. I remember she just had cleaned the house and got the cake ready, flowers, made tea. She was just such a joy to be around. Those are the moments when I think of her, my heart just feels so much joy because the best times were when we'd just make a cup of tea and we'd sit on the floor with digestives and we just talk about anything and nothing, just straightening each other's hair and walking to my grandma's. We'd walk hand in hand. We were like 13, 14, walking hand in hand. And as usual, I'd be complaining, oh, it's too hot. It's a long walk. And she'd say, come on, we need to get the milk for grandma. We need to do this. We need to clean her house. And yeah, she really was just one of the sweetest people you could ever be around. And she wanted a family. She loved children. She dreamed of having a family with the man that she fell in love with, Ramat. And just mentioning him, I'm sure you will have read when you read about this story. Quite tragically, he also lost his life because he committed suicide. And just to add that onto the really tragic story, it breaks my heart because neither of them actually found life after what happened. It was just a loss all around.
Yeah, that was really devastating to read about that he took his own life because I can't imagine like what he went through because that was somebody that he loved and he wanted to build a life with, and he was also really adamant in getting justice for her and really hopeful that that would happen, and ultimately it did. But yeah, that was absolutely, you're right. Like there's just so many layers of tragedy and loss and grief and pain with everything that happened to Banaz and to all of you. But thank you for all those little stories about who she was. And I hope that as much as her story, I think has also, it's done a lot in terms of like, and helping in the, I guess, in like the DV sector in the UK. And I hope we're also able to not just see her as like a reference or like a story, the person that she was. So thank you so much. But you know, we've spoken a lot about how painful and how much grief and loss there has been in your life, and it, you know, I think it started when you were so young, and there's just been like layers and layers of it. But how have you, over the years, worked to process some of that? What has your journey of healing been like, and where do you stand on forgiveness as well?
Oh, how long do you have? Okay, I'm going to tell you about my journey. So, being really transparent, it's not really something I've spoken about too openly. I guess because I probably was a little bit ashamed of my journey leading up to here. But after Banaz passed away, I think the first decade, so I'm going to say from about 2006 to about 2016, that entire decade for me was what I would call self-destruction. And it was pretty much, my mental health was in a really bad way. I was severely depressed, taking a lot of medication, particularly antidepressants, sleeping tablets. So some really dark moments in that decade. And I found myself coping actually through, I would say, abusing medicine that I was given to manage pain. In that time, I actually had quite a big surgery. So I had a hip replacement, which is a story for another day because my parents are first cousins and I was born with a hip disability. But yes, yeah, very. I've lived a lot of lives, Samia. So I had this big surgery in 2015, sorry. And I found myself really abusing the drugs that I was given. So I was on tramadol, which is a very strong painkiller, and I would use that to manage sleep. And I became so addicted. And in those, sadly, alcohol was a big coping mechanism for me, as well as trying through the groups of different people that I was around, just trying pretty much anything and everything to numb the pain, the depression, the anxiety that I was experiencing. I was one of those people that literally anything could move me to just a flood of tears. Sometimes I would be on my way to work. I was working this whole period. I would be on my way to work and I'd miss the train. And that's it. I'm a complete mess. I am crying on the train to work. I'm in absolute bits. Someone would accidentally barge me. I'm already all the way to 100, completely lost all sense. And in that time, again, I found myself homeless. I left my family home and had nowhere to go. I found myself in the YMCA. So that was a really difficult experience, lots of harassment. Just, it was really difficult. I was trying to work to pay my rent at the YMCA. Obviously, this is very naive. Didn't know you had to pay rent, but you do. Had to continue working. But in this time, I was putting up a complete facade. Every time someone met me, my life story was like just the complete opposite to what my actual life story was. And all my friends just thought like my life was lovely and great and lived with my family, etc. So in this period of self-destruction, I sometimes think back, I don't know how I survived, because when I think of some of the really bad moments, some of I think to myself, how did I make it this far? Because there's been some really dark moments. There have been times where I was genuinely convinced that I did not want to be here anymore, that I had nothing to live for. I made some really bad decisions that would harm me. But I guess there's a reason I'm still here. And I lived a lot with what people call survivor's guilt. I felt really guilty for being the one out of me and my sister who is still here and who still gets to live life. And I punished myself for that for a really long time. I think it's something I still struggle with. And somehow, I'm not quite sure how, but I made it out onto the other side. I'd say about, yeah, 2017, I met my partner sorry, more towards the end of 16. I met my partner, and I think it was through talking to him about some of my experiences, what I'd gone through, and his reaction that kind of really, I think, just inspired me to be my true authentic self, because I don't know why, but I just felt very open in telling him my life. And he had no reaction. He's just said, that's some people go through different things, and I'm sorry you've gone through all of that. And I just thought, are you not put off? Do you not think I'm weird? Do you not just want to never speak to me again? And he said, obviously, it's shocking all these things you've gone through, but I'm not going to judge you for it. You're still Payzee. You're still who you are. That doesn't change you as a person. And then slowly I started, I think, being a bit more true to myself and being more honest with people around me. And it's around this time I saw a case in the media, and Raneem Odeh and her mum. I was at the gym and I saw on the BBC that she had been murdered by her ex-husband, and the police were aware of it. They were on the phone to her when she got murdered. It was such a tragic case. And it just seemed too familiar to me. And I thought, I have to do something. And that's how I started becoming the person I am today and entering this space and finding, I would say, my purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how has it been? Because I know you spoke about survivor's guilt, but there must also be, or have been, anger at what had happened, and perhaps, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but perhaps resentment towards family members that that ultimately took your sister's life.
Mm.
And also sometimes it's also there's that disappointment in, say, like your mother who failed to protect you. I don't know if one can ever fully like overcome those things. And you know, the way I like to think about it is more of a like a journey,
Mm-hmm.
and more of, you know, how do we navigate it, how are we carrying it at certain points in our life, how are we letting it impact us or not impact us.
Yeah.
What's that been like for you?
Do you know what? It has been really complex. So, again, transparency. I have had a lot of therapy and I have tried to work through some of these feelings that you mentioned: anger, resentment, and questioning my love, my feelings for people in my family. Endless questions. The one that always comes up is just simply why? Why? And especially in the recent years, becoming a mum, that has added a whole new layer of these feelings and they're really heightened. But I think a big part of me, I wouldn't say I'm someone who I wouldn't say forgiveness is at the top of my feelings, if I'm being really honest. And that's probably because I really struggle compartmentalize my feelings. When I think, and I think this will be something that a lot of people will relate to, especially if they've grown up in quite controlling homes where their parents, in some ways, your question of love for your parents or caregivers, you can't really question that. You don't even allow yourself to question that. That's my parent. I respect them. I was raised like that. Obviously, there's that, but then there's also what you mentioned about being failed and being let down. I can say I have a relationship with my mum. It's complicated. I try really hard to make the most of it. My parents are quite old now, so obviously I have a relationship with my mum, and she's in her 70s, and I try not to think about this too much, but sometimes I think God knows how long we have left together. And I think it would really destroy me if I didn't try and have the best relationship that I could with her before we parted ways. And when I say that, trust me, it's not easy, because the more aware you become of whether it's failures, especially as a mum, and you're looking on the other side now, the more difficult it is to look past people's failures towards you. But I think also doing this work, I've learned to think a lot about the different layers of abuse and relationship. For example, in a lot of our communities, and I absolutely am not saying that women can't be perpetrators, but I recognize that very often within the cycle of abuse, women are somewhere under someone else being abused to carry out abuse. And it doesn't make it right, of course. But I think there are so many layers of rights being stripped for women in our communities, unfortunately. And there's a lot of worry about them being good wives if they do certain things, if they keep the family's name up. So I've got a lot of, I would say, a deeper understanding, which gives me, I think, some compassion towards some of these relationships. But there are also relationships that are just, I think, after you experience certain things with certain people, you just cannot mend certain relationships, and it's impossible. So I try and focus on the ones that I can work through, even though it's really difficult. It's incredibly triggering sometimes. I sometimes spend time with my younger sister, for example, and it's through those conversations that it just hits you. It's a ton of bricks literally in your face. And then I think, whoa, all these things actually happened in our lives, and this is how they impacted us. And I see the things in my younger sister, I see the effect that it's had on her, and I'm sure she sees it in me. And I look from an outsider and I think, wow, as you said, this is like a lifelong journey of healing. It is literally, it just doesn't stop. And I think for me, it's become so intense now that I'm a mum, and I
Mm.
overthink everything. I overthink. Sometimes I'll say no. Sorry. Sometimes I'll say no to my son for a biscuit or something. And then I think, oh my God, is he going to hate me for that? Oh my God. I'm
Yeah.
hyper vigilant to being a caregiver now. I'm hyper vigilant to the way I interact with my son, to the things I say around him, to the way I love him, almost to an extent where my main aim in life is I want him to grow up feeling I was loved unconditionally. That, like, my life will be literally, this is my life goal, that my son is loved unconditionally.
It must be so complicated, actually, now that you are a mother, because and because you don't have the things that you want to instill in your son and the experiences that you want to give him and the environment you want him to live in, you did not have that.
Yeah,
And you did not have it because of a lack of like material wealth or anything, right? Because
yeah.
sometimes, there's that issue that if you grew up with scared of being heard, it's completely different
Hmm.
because you need like a what do they call it, like a blueprint. You need a blueprint of those things in order to understand how you can then bring that out in your family now, in your household now, for your child. So I can only imagine how complex that is. Did you, I don't know if this is going to be a very nice question to ask, but just like understanding the communities and the societies that we come from, and also
Yeah.
like what happened to you and what happened to Banaz. Um, we know that so much of it is a result of patriarchal structures,
Hmm.
right? And that's not to justify anything or
Yeah.
to make anything sound like it's okay, but patriarchy exists all over the world, and in ways that we don't even realize that it's
Hmm.
being impacted the way that it's impacting people. And it here in the UK too, massively as well. It's not just specific to a certain area. But as a result of that, there are some men who are awful to women in terms of how they treat them and the way that they strip their rights and harm them, and entire structures that do that as well. When you found out that you were having a boy, how did you feel about the fact that you were now going to raise who was going to, inshallah, become a man?
I love this question because I didn't actually find out I was having a boy until they placed him on my chest.
Wow, that's great.
And yeah, I chose, and actually, this is obviously because of the way I was raised. Quite sadly, so when my mother was having children, her first child was a boy. And then after my brother, so he's the eldest, after my brother, she birthed six girls.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Lot of girls.
and sadly, her first daughter, my sister Berry, didn't really survive. I can't say she didn't survive because she had a heart condition. So she actually passed away quite early on. And then my mum continued having children, girl after girl. This was something, I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with this, but this idea of gender selection, sex selection when women are pregnant. But my mum was seen by my dad's family as the wrong woman because she kept birthing girls. And
Mhm.
actually, my mum's mum, so my grandma, when she was having children, she had a lot of girls too. A lot of them didn't survive. And then her husband, so my granddad, had a second wife. And miraculously, this woman was birthing boys, even though we know that's more dependent on the man than the woman. But when you can't force education on people, unfortunately, a lot of men still believe that to this day. So when I was pregnant, my mom told me over the years about the suffering, the abuse that she endured for birthing girls. She said every time she birthed another girl, it was like a funeral in the house. And when I was pregnant, when my mom found out, I told her I was pregnant. She said, Inshallah, it's a happy, healthy boy.
Oh,
And
no.
it's that generational trauma that
Yeah.
is passed down. I had already known that for me, if I ever do become a mum, so I became a mum at 35, it wasn't in the plans for the longest. And then I think about 6 months before I got pregnant, I was like, actually, maybe I do want a baby. I never really saw myself as a mum until quite late. So when I got pregnant, I said to my partner, I don't want to know the gender. And the reason I didn't want to know is because I grew up with such a preference to gender. And
Yeah.
it didn't matter to me, girl, boy. My only one mission was to love, protect, and make sure that child is raised in a happy, healthy, safe environment. So we went back and forth, and he kept saying to me, I think it's a girl. And I would say, no, I think it's a boy. And we'd just exchange back and forth. But then I had my scan and I said to the lady at the hospital, please don't tell me the gender because it's not important to us. And she said, oh, we can write it down for you and put it in an envelope. That's fine. We don't want to know.
Yeah.
And yeah, we waited and had no idea. And until the day my son was born, I was really aware of the privilege already, that if it was a boy, the privilege he would be born into, first of all, in the wider world, because men hold privilege, but also in my own community, the idea of birthing a boy, it's almost like some greater achievement than birthing a girl. And I didn't want to feed into that narrative. For me personally, I know lots of people do it, but this idea of like gender reveal is, I just find it such a weird concept that we are
Yes.
like revealing one's gender. It's so crazy to me. So yeah.
And, and then celebrating if it's one
Yeah,
more than the other. Like I just, yeah, I can't. I'm
it's
not really on board with them
toxic.
either. Yeah.
No, it's so toxic. And I've actually seen really horrible videos of men who go absolutely crazy when they find out it's a girl. And as you said, this is such a global thing. We obviously hear it about certain parts of the world, but this is really just a general global thing that somehow birthing boys is seen to be superior and more more special than birthing girls, which I find insane because obviously I love my son, but
Yeah.
if I birthed a girl, I would have been equally as happy. Women carry life. Why wouldn't I celebrate birthing a girl who can literally change this world?
Yeah.
But I'm
Yeah.
super conscious of the way I'm raising him because as well of my background. He's only 2.5 now, but as he grows older and can have conversations, it's really important for me to make sure that he's aware of the world that we live in and he navigates his way through the world in a way that doesn't harm women and girls around him in the world generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I've seen some of the ways that you write and talk about motherhood and the complexities of how your experiences feed into that, but just
Mm,
like your immense love for him, and it's so beautiful
thank
to read,
you.
honestly. And yeah, I just wish you the very best, and I'm
Thank
sure he's a
you.
very happy little toddler, probably running rings around you as well.
Oh
But
yes, yeah. He's my boss. He's my literally my biggest boss. He rules my life. Yeah, no, he's honestly, God has really blessed me. Such a wonderful, so emotionally aware. Whenever I'm not at my best, he literally notices and will ask me if I'm
oh,
happy. And I just, yeah, he just fills me with love and joy. I think it's such a beautiful feeling if someone wants to feel it and wants it in their life. It's, yeah, it's,
yeah.
you can't describe it in words.
Oh, so lovely. I just want to talk briefly. You mentioned already that you you found your purpose, and I love that. I love that, just that idea that you found your purpose. What are some of the things that you've been working on?
So, just to give you a little bit of a backstory as to how I found my purpose, like through the organization that I'm at. Basically, when I saw the story that I mentioned on the news about Raneem Ode and her mum, I immediately thought, why don't I try and work in this space? And I thought of one organization, and the reason I thought of them holds a very special place in my heart. So, they're ICRO Women's Rights Organization. And this organization was set up just over 20 years ago. So they were already set up when Banaz passed away. And my earliest memory of the executive director, Diana Nami, was when Banaz's trial was in the Old Bailey. This woman made a petition and she went around and got signatures, thousands of signatures to ensure justice was served. And I just remember her. I'm 18 years old, and she was outside the courts, this Iranian woman, Kurdish Iranian woman, with a massive banner with Banaz's face on it and screaming her name and calling for justice. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. So, fast forward all these years later, over a decade, I thought, why don't I reach out to them? Maybe there's a way I can work with them. Actually, I didn't even expect them to be still running because I had no awareness and knowledge of this space. So I went online, Googled the Kurdish organization. They came up straight away. I sent over an email and it just went from there. I met one of their amazing staff members who's now a close friend of mine. And we just really clicked. And that's where my journey really began in this world. I had no idea was going to look like. Essentially, it was just for me to lend my expertise or my voice to whatever they were doing. And it was so timely because at the time they were campaigning on child marriage. And it was a match made in heaven. And so, yeah, it was through them that I feel really lucky to have found almost like a second family, all these amazing Kurdish women and my other colleague, Sarah. And through them, I just really got to quite quickly learn about this space and learn about the power of sharing lived experience for change. And it was through them that I met this incredible other woman who's also Iranian, the TEDx curator and director, Mariam Pasha. And she gave me what I would say was a life-changing opportunity of doing a TEDx talk. And I think it's from there that my world in this space like really opened up, and I was able to engage in this really meaningful work. So I would say the work that I've been doing first and foremost has been around child marriage. Obviously, as you mentioned at the beginning, the age of marriage was 16, which is just so shocking. And we, thank God, managed to get that changed. That was always the objective. And update that law to 18 with no exceptions. So the one great thing about that campaign, which I'm really proud of, was that the law doesn't only involve marriages that are held in a legal setting. So they involve Islamic, whatever religion marriage. So cultural, religious, and customary. So we're talking about all forms of marriages.
Yeah.
And that was really important because obviously I think you miss a lot of people if you're just talking about registered marriages. And we also worked on that same year, which was again another legislative change. We worked on virginity testing and hymenoplasty.
Okay.
Which, believe it or not, was actually available and legal in the UK for thousands of pounds. Really abusive.
Really? Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, we actually worked on a ITV documentary, which should be on iPlayer, about virginity testing in the UK. So you had all these clinics in Highley Street that were charging thousands of pounds to young, vulnerable women to give them certificates to prove that they are virgins. And obviously this plays into the abuse, and it's a very traumatic thing to have to go through. So we also managed to get that changed. So now in England, Wales, virginity testing and hymenoplasty are both illegal, and it's a criminal offence to carry those out, which is great. And now we're focusing on housing, so safe, adequate housing for survivors and victims. We're always, to be honest, our general kind of like campaigning overarching theme is anything that falls under honor-based abuse, forced marriage, child marriage, honor killings, female genital mutilation, are stuck in marriages that they can't divorce in, for example, under Sharia law, marriages that aren't registered. So we're pretty much, I'd say, vocal on all those issues. It's so hard because there's so many things that I want to campaign on, and I wish I had all the time in the world, but I actually only work part-time at the organization. But yeah, so all these issues are really close to my heart, all women's issues. And on a personal level, especially now being a mum, I'm really passionate about parents' rights, mothers' rights, the invisible load, all those themes that really impact our lives. I would say femicide as well, which just seems this year and always just to be never ending. Yeah. Very difficult work to engage in, especially as a survivor, but so important because I think women just need to continue to speaking up and saying enough is enough. We need change desperately. I was just reading actually today about the case in France, the French woman who is taking her husband to court because of the decade of abuse that she had endured while he was drugging her. It's really appalling, and these experiences of abuse that women experience, they're just, it's almost like a language that women speak globally.
Yeah, and there's still globally, I think is it Iraq that's recently tried to bring back child marriage?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just, yeah, it feels like sometimes I just feel so confused because I feel like in so many ways the world is moving forwards, and then
Yes.
in so many ways it's moving insanely backwards.
Yeah.
Like Absolutely
Yeah,
crazy.
it's heartbreaking.
But you did talk about that you do campaign on female genital mutilation,
Yeah.
FGM. And I know we don't have too much time because we've already been talking for a long time. I could talk to you all day. But I find this issue really, I want to use the word interesting, but it's not the right word to use. I don't know what the right word to use is, but I have done some work around this issue, particularly in Kenya.
Okay.
But I think the thing that continually keeps coming up is that it happens to people in the UK, and that I think is one of the most like shocking things. But I I read that you also are a survivor.
Mhm.
And obviously, feel free to talk as little or as much as you want on this issue. But what are some of the things that you think that we really should be aware about it? Because most people don't really either know what it is
Yeah,
or know that it is indeed happening.
yeah. So I think there's so many misconceptions when it comes to issues like female genital mutilation. But the first one that I would say is one that you touched on, is this idea that it's something that happens in certain regions of the world, certain communities, but really it is such a global issue. It used to be practiced here in the UK as a tradition many years ago. But most of the time you hear about it, I feel, in continents like Africa or the Middle East and sometimes Asia. But actually, I think it needs to be a lot more of an inclusive conversation. Sometimes when I tell people that I experienced a female genital mutilation in Iran, where I grew up, they say, "Oh, really? It doesn't really happen there." And I say, "No, it does happen there because I experienced it there. My sisters, my cousins, lots of women that I know that I'm related to experienced it." I think this misconception having this misconception really drives the conversation away from this is important, we need to talk about it, to actually it doesn't really affect us because it doesn't happen here. So I think just
Mm.
really shifting our focus around where it happens. But I would also say, I think we talk a lot about the physical element of it. Obviously, we know it's cutting of the genitalia, but I think
Mm.
alongside of that, a really important conversation is the long-term psychological impact of it, which is often overlooked because yes, it's a physical act, but it's also a lot of trauma in the body, and I think that can lead to quite severe mental health issues, anxiety around your body, depression, and obviously a lot of issues with sexual intimacy. For me, when I became a mum, it was the first thing that horrified me because I thought, what if this affects how I give birth? What if this affects how I carry my son? No, it was something that was like literally at the forefront of my thoughts. And when I did get screened, I remember when they asked me the questions and I said I was a survivor of FGM, they had me like do special tests and they made me see a special midwife, and I all I could think about was, oh my god, there's something going to be wrong. And again, that part of that conversation, we don't really talk about it, but becoming a mom and being a survivor, having such an intimate experience of giving birth, and some women experience pain throughout their lives on their periods and have lots of issues around sexual intimacy. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions, but I think it's really important. Like you said, so many people don't know about it. I do think that this should be a conversation that everyone is aware of, regardless of where you're from, how old you are, what area you work in, students, young people, professionals. I think everyone should know about it because it's so overlooked. Like you said, it actually happens here, and girls are still taken out of the country for female genital mutilation. Earlier this year, we actually had sadly a case of a mother who took her daughter out of the country, and it did happen to her. And the mother was similar age to me, 36, 37, and she ended up going to prison. So it does happen, but I think I'm not sure why, but a lot of these issues are generally put towards the back of people's minds. Even child marriage, since doing this work, I've spoken to people who are British girls who've experienced, Irish girls who've experienced child marriage here in the UK. I'm in touch with organizations in the US where, believe it or not, child marriage is a huge prevalent issue in the States. I'm talking
Mm.
about some of the states have a 14-year-old age limit
Oh
as
my
of now.
goodness.
Yeah. And this is something that most people don't realize.
Mm.
Places like California, you can be married at the age of 11 and it's not illegal.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. People think, oh, America, West, you're like a very modern society. But these issues are so deeply, as you said before, in like they are ingrained in patriarchy and they benefit men. And men are usually making these laws about women for women. That's why
Mm.
it's so important for us to speak up and say, no, we know what is best for us.
Absolutely, because even the laws, quote unquote, that are like in the UK that give women rights, the fact that it is illegal to beat your wife and those sorts of things, those are very recent, like
Yeah.
very recent.
Yeah.
Like we may be the first generation that in our entire lifetime will benefit from those, but it's very recent. And so I'm so glad that we spoke about it because I do think people need to know more.
Yeah.
And I know, especially when it comes to FGM, like it's not an easy thing to talk about. And I think
Yeah.
people do feel a little bit uncomfortable
Hmm.
with it because it's such an intimate issue
Yeah.
as well, physically. But that makes it even more important for us to talk about it. And as you said, like the long-term psychological impacts definitely need to be spoken about. But Paisley, I have one final question, and then we will have to say goodbye before I go too long. But this is a podcast where we talk a lot about books.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any books that had particularly helped you or inspired you, or if you have any books in mind that people could read if they wanted to learn more about anything that we've discussed today.
So I wish I could say read my book, but I don't have a book yet. Hopefully one day I will. This question, I love it because books have really helped me. So one book, so I basically wrote a few because I was like, oh my God, how do I answer this question? There's so many books I love. The first book I will say that I read, that I saw myself in, I saw my sisters in, I saw such a huge representation, even though she's South Asian. And you might have heard this book, but I read a book by Jasvinder Sangera, who founded
Okay.
Karma Nirvana. And
Mm.
the book is called Shame. And
Mm.
it resonated so deeply with me because basically the book is about herself, Jasvinder, who ended up leaving home because she was being forced into a marriage. And she went on to leave home very young. I think she was 17 years old. Really struggled to go on with her life, became a mother quite young, and sadly endured more abuse later on. But it's really a story of strength and so much resilience for me because she went on to found her charity all those years ago in the UK, and it's still running and it's so important. It's such a incredible, inspiring story of resilience, hope, and fighting for your. That's one that I would say is top of my list. Second book I will say is a book called Girl with a Gun, and it's actually by my executive director, Diana Nami. And
Ooh.
her book is a memoir about obviously her life and her journey as a young Kurdish girl in Iran who became a human rights activist. And it really dives into the struggles of growing up in a repressive society, growing up in Iran, and her fight against that kind of lifelong oppression, but also her commitment to defending women and girls' rights. So that's another story that for me really inspires me. And I think, especially in the wake of Women, Life, Freedom, I would highly recommend people to read this book and learn about Diana Nami's work. Can I say one more?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh my gosh, I have so many. Okay, but I think I'm going to have to say Khalid Hosseini's A Thousand Splendid Suns. Oh my gosh, have you read that?
Yeah, I have. I
Oh
read
my
Khaled.
God, that book is, I can't tell you how many times I cried reading that book. Again, I saw a lot of myself reading that book, huge representation, but he just writes so beautifully. He really captures every part of you mentally, just you're very present. So another book that I really adore. I have so many books, and actually I should share more about what I read, but I pick up a book and I've always been like this from as young as I can remember. I read all the Goosebumps books in 3 hours every time I pick a new one from the library. Do you remember Goosebumps? But I should take more time. I love reading. I think actually for me, especially reading women's memoirs, like I just recently read Britney Spears. Oh my God, love Britney Spears. I always adored her. Reading women's stories of their lived experience is something that for me just really, really helps me. And as well as self-help books like mental health and now motherhood. Yeah, there's so many, but I'll say those three because they're very, and obviously Malala's I Am Malala, that's one that is like incredibly powerful for me because that's in terms of resilience and speaking out no matter what the risks are. That's one that's very much at the top. Yeah, love Malala.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope that one day we can add a book by Payzee onto that list of amazing books to read.
Yeah. Should I say one last one? Because this one really helped me in my campaigning.
Yeah.
And I just saw it by my desk here. The final book that really helped me was given to me by my campaigner friend, Sarah. And it's by Gina Martin called Be the Change. And when I was campaigning on child marriage, this book was like literally so many notes all over it. It really helped me because she obviously campaigned to bring in the law against upskirting. And it really helped me to read through another woman's eyes and experience and words, how she navigated that journey. And it was really helpful for me. So highly recommend if anyone's in campaigning or interested.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. Thank you for that amazing list of books. And thank you for your time, Payzee. It was so wonderful speaking to you. I absolutely loved every minute of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Samia. Thank you so much for having me. It was a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it too.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review as it helps more people find the show.